Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Truth, Lies, and Nonsense. And today we're going to talk about something that's been in the news pretty predominantly in the last year or so, and that has to do with Israel and the Middle East. But specifically, we're going to talk about the U.S. in Israel, and something that's been on my mind for a while. And it took me a while to kind of dig down and try to figure out, why do we have a relationship with Israel? I mean, we all know that we're friends with Israel. I mean, nobody really doubts that now. That's been going on for quite some time. Not as long as people think, not since the beginning of Israel. So why is the U.S. so invested in protecting Israel? And it might not be for the reasons that you think, and it might not be for the political reasons or the humanitarian reasons or whatever else you want to come up with. There might be something else in there worth considering, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So we know that during the Jewish people's return to Israel after World War II, the U.S. had an embargo on arms to the Jews in Palestine. I found that curious when I first heard this, as we were not supporting militarily with arms the Jews moving to Palestine. We were, pretty much against arming them. We even had quotas on how many people from Europe could immigrate to the U.S. by racial group. In Hebrew, until 1943, was considered a racial group, so there was a limit to how many Hebrew/Jewish people could emigrate into the United States, and this was throughout World War II as well. Well, 1943, almost halfway through before that changed. Curiously enough, I thought, or surprisingly, I should say, not curious, is a Gallup poll was taken in November 24 and 25 of 1938, which was 2 weeks after Kristallnacht. If people don't remember what that is, or if they're not paying attention too much to history back then in Germany, that's when the Germans, I think it was the brown shirts, smashed up all the Jewish stores and broke all their windows and stuff, and basically were, for lack of a word, terrorizing the Jews in Germany. Well, there was a poll taken in 1938 on November 24 and 25, and they was asking Americans, should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the United States to live? 72% responded no. So it wasn't really a great groundswell of Jewish support in the 30s. I'm not sure it increased that much to the 40s, since we had an embargo on helping the Jews with arms move to Palestine. So from, let's say, 1953 to 61, U.S. provided Israel with moderate amount of economic aid, mostly as loans for basic foodstuffs and things like that. Support, the best way I could hear it was unevenly grew for Israel during the Kennedy and Johnson's presidencies. From what I saw, what I've looked up, not diving too deep, but news reports and other things like that from that time, we weren't really that in love with Israel in those days. We kind of just, they were out there. We were more concerned with other aspects of the world, communism, the Soviet Union, things like that. Well, it seemed that tensions actually grew between the U.S. and Israel after their attack on the U.S. Navy ship, the USS Liberty, during the Six-Day War. That was almost a significantly damaging aspect to U.S.-Israeli relations, but we held on. During the 60s and the 70s, though, the Arab states were drifting closer into alliances with the Soviet Union, which drew the U.S. closer to Israel. That makes sense. We're befriending Israel, and the Soviets are going to be befriending the Arabs. I mean, as we know, the Muslims and the Jews are pretty much arch enemies in that area. So as we support one, Soviets support the other. It wasn't really until the 1970s that our support for Israel really, I think, enhanced. And the pivotal moment came as a result of the Yom Kippur War, and the Soviets were supplying the Arab forces. The Arabs invaded, Israel, or they did pretty well at first, but then Israel started pushing them back quite significantly. And that resulted in the Soviets were supplying the Arab forces, which caused Nixon to resupply Israel, which led to the OPEC embargo, and basically kept pushing us closer and closer, or more in bed with Israel than perhaps we otherwise would have liked. So, you ask yourself, why are we so attached to Israel. It solidified, over the years, over the last 80 years, but you have to ask yourself why. Why were we supporting Israel over the Arabs? Did we feel sorry for them, for what happened to them in Europe, even though U.S. had really nothing to do with what happened to them in Europe? So I ask myself, is it national security reasons? And I have to say no. Israel has no real direct bearing on our sovereignty or protecting our national interests. We don't need bases in Israel. They don't really supply us with any kind of military might that bolsters our stance in the world. So I'd say national security reasons for us in Israel, limited at best. Perhaps today they provide us some insight and some secrets on what's going on in the area, but that's more out of a necessity because we're in bed with them now and we've chosen our sides over the last 80 years. Economic reasons. I would say no, it has nothing to do with economic reasons either. And that is I'm going to bring it up right now in a second, is Israel only accounts for less than 1% of all imports in the United States. We don't really get a lot from Israel. I mean, it was surprising when I looked at it. We'll pull it up here real briefly. So as you can see here, there's not a lot that they bring into us. We're not, they don't import a lot to us. We don't really need them economically like perhaps somebody might think we do. It's just not there. So you have to ask yourself, why would we put our nation at odds with the Arab world, the Muslim world? A bunch of countries, a religious group that controls vast amounts of oil resources. Instead, we choose a country that has comparatively no natural resources and no strategic value to us, really, compared to what we would have had we allied ourselves with the Arab world. So, I kind of, something that I ponder, and I look back, and perhaps it's for a totally undiscussed reason. I would say it looks like it started maybe back in the 70s with the Israeli courting the U.S. Christian politicians in the United States, and a common theme that was gaining traction throughout the Christian world in the U.S. at that time. A theme that really, the beginning of the end times was imminent. And that might come a little surprising for you that I'm going down that path. But let's back up a little bit into the late 1800s. And perhaps the structure of that belief that the end times were imminent can be traced back to England in the late 1800s with Christian Zionism and a man by the name of Theodore Herzl. Herzl established the first Zionist Congress, and the goal of the Congress was to create, quote, to create for the Jewish people a home in Israel, the Holy Land, secured by law. I found that curious. It's like in the 1800s, they wanted to find a land for the Jews in the Holy Land, which is Palestine. That's where it is. Herzl believed that the Bible had a prophecy that the Jews needed to return to Israel, reestablish the Jewish state, rebuild the Jewish temple that had been destroyed there by the Romans in 70 AD. Why did he believe this? Only with the creation of the Jewish state and the rebuilding of the temple could Jesus return, according to prophecy that he found in various Bible passages. So support for the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine gained significant strength with what became known as the Balfour Declaration. It was a letter sent on November 2, 1917, by the English Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, calling for the creation of the Jewish state in Palestine. And as we know, in 1948, after World War II, several years after World War II, the British allowed the Jews in Europe to land in Palestine. They allowed them to go there and bring arms with them. The British controlled Palestine before and after World War II, and they opened the doors for them to go there. So now I ask myself, okay, how did that belief affect Americans' U.S. political support for Israel? Much has been written on the rationale of U.S. supporting Israel politically, strategic level, and I still think there's maybe a deeper rationale, one that's kind of percolating in the back of our Christian politicians' minds, and they don't want to admit it because it might sound to some kind of like lunacy. But let's turn, like I said, I think it started gaining strength in the 1970s. So let's turn to a book written in the 1970s by Hal Lindsey, The Late Great Planet Earth. For lack of a better term or a description of this book, it's a guide to the events that he believed had started concerning the end times in the second coming of Jesus. Lindsey cites several passages from the Bible concerning events foretold in the Bible that would happen before the end and signal Jesus' return. Critical to his reasoning was the formation of Israel in 1948 and the Jewish control of Jerusalem, as foretold in the book of Daniel and indicated by Jesus in Matthew 24, 32-34. Significant, Lindsey references prophecy that the Jewish temple that was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans would be rebuilt in Jerusalem on the exact location where it once stood. Furthermore, for the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, to arrive for the first time for them, the temple also needed to be rebuilt on its original location in Jerusalem. Now, the problem with this is that one of the most sacred locations in Islam now stands at the exact location where the Jewish temple once stood, the Dome of the Rock and the shrine there. So for the Jewish temple to be rebuilt, the Dome of the Rock and the Islamic shrine there would need to be destroyed. Now imagine if Israel destroyed the Islamic shrine and the Dome of the Rock and rebuilt their temple as prophesied by both Christian and Jewish prophets. That would surely lead to an escalation of hostilities and the start of a war in the region, and possibly another world war. Now, Christians believe the end of the world, the rapture, are precursors to Jesus' return. Most of these beliefs come from the book of Revelations that are described end times at length, or AKA the revelation of St. John the Divine. A few come from the Gospels and more from the Old Testament. So a war starting over the events in the Middle East between the Jews and the Muslims isn't all that concerning to fundamentalist Christians, as it would mean Jesus would soon be coming back. And that's a good thing for Christians. They've been waiting for this for a long time. So again, to sum it up, Jesus can't return and will not return until the end times. So the end times must start for Jesus' return to be imminent. The question is, when will the end times begin? And Jesus says that nobody will know the date or the time of it happening, but that doesn't stop prophets from trying to predict it and writers trying to predict